Imagine an old family photograph taken in Chicago in 1901. The father stands solemnly, the mother sits upright, the children look into the lens. Everything seems normal, almost warm. But then, in a hidden corner of the room, there is a detail that makes time stand still. A figure, faint quiet, not part of the joy of that photo shoot. From that small detail, a whole curtain of history is pulled back. Behind the luxurious facade of the Whitmore family are secrets that Chicago never wanted to face. Forgotten diary pages, prayers in the dark of a priest, and lost records of immigrant girls who suddenly disappeared. Tonight, we will follow the trail of a photograph to learn the chilling story of disappearance of power that hides evil and of voices that have been silenced for more than a century. Do you dare take a closer look at that picture? 1901. An ordinary family sits for a photograph in their living room. The father is solemn in his Sunday suit. The mother is in a high-necked, delicately laced dress. The three children are straight, their eyes wide open, seemingly forced to remain silent for the endless shutter. On a velvet chair, the two daughters sit timidly. The son, Thomas, stands stiffly next to his father's chair. A seemingly ordinary moment for an American family in the early 20th century. But there is something strange about the photograph. A small detail hidden in a dark corner of the room. And it is that detail that makes Dr. Margaret Chen, a historical archivist in Chicago, stop in the middle of her daily work. She has been going through thousands of old photos for more than 2 decades, but never before had a photograph made her lean toward the lamplight, her heart pounding, whispering, "It can't be." In the shadow of the wall, what Margaret had initially thought was just a decorative vase appeared in an unusual shape. The proportions were off. The darkness seemed to hide it. It didn't look like anything that belonged in the room. She raised her magnifying glass, the late Chicago sunlight streaming through the window, gilding the time-stained photograph. And then a shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't just a family photo. This could be evidence of something much darker. A secret that had lain dormant for over a century. Margaret's hand shook slightly as she put the magnifying glass down. She knew. This discovery could change the story of the Whitmore family, forever turning them from a model figure to an untold mystery. That afternoon, she began digging into the archives. Old inscriptions, newspaper clippings, bits and pieces of history emerged. The Whitmore family had lived in an upscale neighborhood on Chicago's north side in a sturdy brick house. James Whitmore, the father in the photograph, was a wealthy grain merchant, a pillar of the community. His wife, Helen, was known for her philanthropy, helping immigrants who had just arrived in the city after the Great Fire of 1871. They attended church, contributed money to social causes, and were considered a respectable family. At least, that was the surface story. As Margaret flipped through the documents, she noticed strange gaps. In 1901, they were clearly present, but by 1902, all traces had disappeared. Not a single newspaper entry, not a single church record, not a single mention. All that remained was that this house had been sold in early 1903 to pay off debts. After that, the darkness swallowed up the Whitmore name entirely. And then, faint notes hidden in personal diaries and letters from the time reveal a different tone. A Chicago society lady once wrote in her diary, that she was relieved that the unpleasant rumors surrounding the Whitmores were finally put to rest. What rumors? No one wrote them down. Just vague phrases enough for Margaret to sense that something was very wrong. As dusk cast long shadows across the office window, Margaret returned to the photograph. The family still looked perfect. But that shadow in the corner, that absurd shape, seemed to mock all the respect, all the fame they had ever possessed. And so, Margaret made a decision that would drag her into weeks of sleepless nights. She had to find out where the Whitmores had gone. And in that seemingly ordinary photograph, what had they inadvertently revealed to the light? Do you find yourself starting to wonder if it was just a dark corner? Why did it make an entire family disappear from history? The next morning, Margaret barely slept. The image of the dark corner of the photograph haunted her all night, like a whisper that wouldn't leave. As dawn was just beginning to touch the buildings of Chicago, she showed up at the Historical Society with renewed determination. The first person she thought of was Dr. James Morrison, a colleague at Northwestern University. He was renowned for his expertise in photographic analysis and historical forensics. Margaret called him before the clock struck 8. There was an urgency in her voice that made Morrison pay attention immediately. An hour later, he appeared with a full suite of specialized tools, powerful magnifying glasses, a digital scanner, and old photo-retouching software. The two of them bent over the Whitmore photograph, the flashlight illuminating the faded paper. Morrison was silent for a long time. Then finally, he spoke softly, his voice heavy. "Margaret, this isn't furniture. The way the light falls, the shape, the proportions. I'm afraid what you're seeing is evidence of a crime." The room froze. Each zoom in on the photo made the shadowy shape more and more visible. And as the image became clearer, the two of them fell silent. It was a human figure, small, squishy, not at all in the fixed pose of the other members. A child, a still body. Margaret shuddered. "We have to call the police." Morrison sighed. "Even though this is over 100 years old, this could be evidence of a case that has never been investigated." Margaret nodded, torn. Part of her wanted to continue digging on her own, but she knew a historian's responsibility is not just to record, but to find the truth. A few days later, the file was in the hands of the Chicago Police Department. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, a veteran of the cold case unit, had seen countless strange cases, but never had she had to investigate based on a photograph taken in 1901. At first, the police department was skeptical. What could a photograph more than a century old do? But when the image was clarified by Morrison and Margaret, the silence in the Historical Society conference room spoke volumes. "I have to admit, this is a first," Rodriguez said quietly. "But what you found is enough to warrant a serious investigation." With her was Officer Michael Park, a forensic photographer. He stared intently at the laptop screen where the photo's shadowy edges were clearly visible. Then, in a calm but cold voice, he said, "This is not the position of a conscious person. This is the body of a person who was forced or unconscious, or maybe dead when the photo was taken." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. She muttered, "But how could the whole family take a picture? with this thing right behind them. How could the photographer not notice? Rodriguez looked intently at the faces of each member of the photograph, then spoke softly, as if afraid to awaken something that had been dormant for too long. Look at them. The father. His eyes are averted as if he is hiding. The mother's smile doesn't reach her eyes. The children, stiff, worried. This isn't just a family photo. This is a portrait of a family keeping a secret. And in that moment, Margaret understood her curiosity had gone beyond academic research. She had touched something bigger, darker. And now, there was no turning back. Do you think that figure is really a body? Or is it just a trick of light, a trick of time? They were no longer mere historians. Now Margaret and her team were faced with the possibility of bringing justice to a victim, a death that had been shrouded in silence for over a century. The responsibility was so heavy that Margaret felt her shoulders shake every time she looked at the old photograph. With Detective Sarah Rodriguez's team officially involved, the investigation quickly expanded. Every file, every surviving record of the Whitmore family was searched. Margaret became the key link because she was the one most familiar with the complex layers of early 20th century Chicago archives. And the deeper they dug, the picture of the once respectable family became darker. James Whitmore, the man in the formal suit, suddenly appeared to be no longer the model grain merchant. When the financial analysis was collated, Rodriguez discovered mysterious cash deposits in his accounts in 1900 and 1901, large sums with no clear explanation. And coincidentally, this was also a time when Chicago was troubled by organized crime and labor unrest. But the cash was just the tip of the iceberg. What really made the atmosphere in the investigation room heavy were the personnel records. The Whitmores, it seemed, had a constant turnover of servants. Maid, cook, nanny. They came and went, most within months, even weeks, before disappearing, without leaving an address. Helen Whitmore, the good wife in the eyes of society, kept advertising in the newspapers for a discreet, trustworthy maid available for private family service. Rodriguez frowned as he read the old newspaper clippings. In those days, people who were hired into a wealthy family stayed for years. But here, everyone left so quickly. It was obvious something was wrong with that house. And then a turning point came. Margaret found an old diary in the vaults of the Chicago Immigration Museum. The owner of the notebook was Martha O'Brien, an Irish woman who had worked as a cook for the Whitmores in early 1901. Her scribbled but clear lines were chilling to read. The master stays up at odd hours. Guests come in the middle of the night, and I am told never to open the door after dark. Mrs. Whitmore told me sternly never to enter the drawing room without permission, and never to ask about the sounds coming from that room. The last page of the diary was suffocating. I cannot stay in that house another day. The things I saw with my eyes, the unfortunate figure I glimpsed in the corner. I fear for my life. I pray God to forgive them because I cannot. Holding those lines in hand, the investigation team began to review the missing persons reports of 1901. And then a tragic coincidence appeared. In the police archives, they found the file of a man named Patrick Sullivan. He was desperate to find his sister Bridget Sullivan, 18, who had recently left her hometown of County Cork, Ireland, for Chicago to work as a maid for wealthy families. In his reports, Patrick described his sister as a hard-working, obedient girl who could not leave without sending a message home. Bridget had disappeared in March 1901, and then the pieces fell into place. Bridget Sullivan was the maid the Whitmores had hired in February of that year, just weeks before she disappeared. In a letter to her family, Bridget had hinted that she was feeling uneasy. She mentioned strange things happening in the new house and that she would be looking for another job. But Bridget's final words in Patrick's report left everyone speechless. The landlord has unnatural tastes. I have seen things no Christian soul should witness. After that, no one heard from her again. As Dr. Morrison continued to sharpen the photo, the figure in the corner of the room became clearer. No longer a vague silhouette, but a body. The hem of a turn-of-the-century girl's dress, an arm twisted at an unnatural angle, and most clearly what looked like a rope around the wrist. Margaret slumped back in her chair. A feeling of nausea rose up in her. She hoped she was wrong. She hoped it was just a trick of the light. But no. The Whitmore family portrait was hiding a body. Do you think Bridget Sullivan was the silhouette in the photo? Or was there another darker truth waiting to be revealed? They killed her. And then they posed for a family portrait, with her body still in the room. How could anyone be so cold, so cruel? Detective Rodriguez spoke softly, as if weighed down by what he had seen. People have been capable of terrible things throughout history. What makes this different is that they chose to preserve their crime. This photograph became evidence they never imagined they were leaving behind. As the investigation deepened, the darkness spread far beyond Bridget Sullivan's murder. A pattern emerged, something hidden beneath Chicago's glittering social circles in the early 1900s. James Whitmore, so polished in reputation, was tied to a secretive organization. No name was ever given, but in private letters, it was whispered about only as the Society. What they uncovered in sealed archives was the kind of truth even seasoned investigators dreaded. This society preyed on the vulnerable immigrant women who came alone to America, working quietly in wealthy homes. Many were Irish, Italian, Polish, young, invisible, and when they disappeared, no one in power bothered to look for them. Authorities brushed it aside, just unreliable girls who must have moved on. But the records told a different story. Whitmore's respectable grain business was nothing more than a mask. His true fortune came from trafficking these women to wealthy men throughout the Midwest. That photograph, Rodriguez realized, was not a mistake. It was a trophy, a dark proof of belonging. The way the Whitmore family smiled so casually with Bridget's body blurred behind them chilled investigators to the bone. This was not their first crime. It was part of a ritual that had become normal within their walls. Margaret uncovered more in the archives of St. Patrick's Church. Father Thomas McKenna, a quiet parish priest, had left behind pages of heartbreak in his private journals. He wrote of families who came to him desperate to find daughters, sisters' wives who had vanished. His words, preserved since 1901, carried a chilling weight. The evil that preys upon our most vulnerable souls continues to grow. I fear that among our city's most respected citizens lurk predators who see these innocent girls as nothing more than commodities to be traded and discarded. McKenna's notes listed 12 names, 12 young women, all recent immigrants, all working in homes on Chicago's wealthy North Side. All disappeared between 1899 and 1902. And not one case was truly investigated. Each was brushed away as a runaway. Now the reason for the Whitmore family's sudden disappearance came into focus. In late 1901, Father McKenna had grown bolder. He had begun writing directly to city officials, pressing police to investigate naming powerful families outright, including the Whitmores. At first, Superintendent Francis O'Neill dismissed the priest's fears, but McKenna would not relent. His letters became sharper, more urgent. He was connecting the dots too clearly, and the Whitmores knew it. That eerie photograph of Bridget Sullivan, investigators realized, had been taken in March 1901, days after her disappearance, and only weeks before Father McKenna began his formal inquiries. It wasn't just a family memento. It was a record, a twisted ledger for the society's private satisfaction. By December of that year, James Whitmore had begun selling off his holdings, turning property into cash and gold. By February 1902, the entire family was gone from Chicago, leaving only debts and former associates who would bear the weight of suspicion. Through passenger lists and immigration records, Rodriguez's team began to trace their escape. The Whitmores fled quietly, their trail beginning on a coal train platform in Chicago. They rode eastward to New York City, and from there boarded a steamship bound for Argentina. In the early 1900s, Argentina was a haven for those seeking to vanish. Extradition agreements with the United States were limited, and many wealthy Americans in trouble found refuge on its distant shores. There in Buenos Aires, James Whitmore became Santiago Blanco, a cattle baron with a polished Spanish name. His wife Helen reinvented herself as Elena. Even their children shed their past, adopting new identities as if erasing the shadows behind them. They lived in comfort, while in Chicago, families waited in silence, never knowing what had become of their daughters. Can you imagine that bitter truth? To know that the guilty found prosperity, while the innocent remained unmarked graves in memory alone. Detective Rodriguez could not let that be the final word. With Margaret and the Chicago Historical Society, she began documenting every thread of the case, ensuring that the victims would not simply vanish into history's void. The first step was finding their descendants. Through old immigration records, family trees, and parish archives, they traced living relatives. Bridget Sullivan's bloodline was still in Chicago. Her great-great-nephew, Michael Sullivan, worked as a carpenter, entirely unaware of his family's hidden tragedy. When Margaret met him, he listened in stunned silence. For over a century, he whispered, our family believed Bridget had disappeared into America. My great-grandfather never stopped looking for her. He died waiting for a letter that never came. The truth broke him, but it also gave something back, a final answer to a question that had haunted generations. A comprehensive report was prepared with the Chicago Police Department. Time had erased the chance of trials or punishment, but the report became something else, an official record, a memorial in ink and paper, ensuring that the names of the lost were spoken again. But one object weighed heavily on their hearts: the photograph. That single, terrible portrait. It was proof of murder, yet also a grotesque relic. What should be done with it? After long discussions with ethicists, advocacy groups, and families, the choice was made. The photograph would remain in police archives, sealed but preserved. At the same time, a memorial would be built to honor the women. without displaying their suffering. Father McKenna's private papers revealed that he had carried his hope until his death in 1923. In one of his final diary entries, he wrote, "Though evil may flourish for a time in darkness, truth has a way of eventually coming to light. I pray that someday these innocent souls will receive the justice they deserve." And in a way, they did. 6 months after Margaret first noticed the detail in the Whitmore portrait, St. Patrick's Church filled with voices. A memorial service was held for Bridget and 11 other young women. Their names, once buried in silence, were spoken aloud. For the first time, they were remembered not as vanishing servants, but as daughters, sisters, and human beings. The story reached Ireland, where it struck deep chords. Bridget's homeland embraced her memory again, and the Irish government formally commended Margaret and the Chicago Police Department for uncovering what had once been hidden. Still, Margaret's research pressed forward. She followed the Whitmores into Argentina, discovering that Santiago Blanco, James Whitmore's second self, died in Buenos Aires in 1923. Elena followed in 1931. Their children thrived, living as respected Argentines. None ever faced the shadow of their father's crimes. Eventually, the photograph was displayed as part of an exhibition at the Chicago Historical Society, Hidden Truths, Uncovering Forgotten Crimes Through Historical Evidence. Thousands came to see it, not for the horror of the image, but for the story it carried. A reminder that history does not only live in textbooks. Sometimes it hides in an attic pressed between the pages of a letter or in the corner of a faded photograph. Every artifact has a voice, Margaret told the crowd. Sometimes it tells us stories of love and triumph. And sometimes it whispers the names of those silenced by power. Years later, as Detective Rodriguez stood at her own retirement ceremony, she thought back to that case. "We couldn't arrest anyone," she admitted, "but we gave the victims back their place in history. Sometimes that's the only justice we can offer. But it is still justice." The corner of the Whitmore parlor, once a stage for silence, had finally given up its secret. It told not only of one family's cruelty, but of a broader truth, the fragility of immigrants in a world stacked against them, and the enduring need to search for justice. No matter how many years have passed,